So Ashley, thanks for joining us once again for a podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be back. It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. So let's start with 8.5 years is a long time. And so if you were to compress those 8.5 years into about 4 minutes, what do you think, what's sort of been the contours of your life over this last nearly decade as you've deepened with your work in the psychedelic space and now as you've come out with this new book, Quieting the Storm Within?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that last podcast we were really talking about a lot of the community activism work that I was doing. I started the AWARE Project, which is the Southern California Psychedelic Society. And at that time, so we ran the AWARE Project up into COVID pretty regularly. And now the AWARE Project still continues in San Diego under some friends down there. And since then, I have been a study coordinator on the MAPS clinical trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD. And I also was able, even though I wasn't a therapist at the time, they invited me to come do the therapist training with them. And I was able to do the therapist training because I was also doing Hakomi and some somatic psychotherapy practices. And they said, you're clearly suited for this work. Go back to get your master's now, and then we'll worry about your hours. And so I went back and got a master's degree in social work and then got out and did all of my hours, which took several years, but worked at a ketamine clinic in Los Angeles that I sort of unofficially helped co-found, and the California Center for Psychedelic Therapy, and did a lot of work in ketamine work there. Became a therapist on the MDMA clinical trials, which has been such a gift to be able to have had that moment in time in history, to be able to be a part of such important work. And there's, we could talk on and on about my experiences with that, but that was so exciting. And then since then, I have started my own practice. I do ketamine work and psychedelic integration, harm reduction, and have then written this book. So I've been really using a lot of internal family systems in my work as a practitioner. And it's really shifted the way that I've supported clients, and then also it really aligned with how I saw myself and how I saw kind of a broader context, especially through my psychedelic work. So they've gone hand in hand, and now I'm just kind of diving more and more into this world
of IFS.
Yes,
great,
and psychedelics obviously too. But with
we've been
all
doing psychedelics
of the
a while now. So.
while.
Yeah.
So
this is like a new thing, a new modality that I've also, we have a lot of practitioners who have gone through our training program that are doing underground work at the overlap of very low dose 5-MeO DMT with sort of titrated pen work with internal family systems therapy. And they've found that parts work combined with these very low doses of 5-MeO is really impactful for people. It can be really transformative for them.
Yeah, it's been useful for nearly any psychedelic assisted therapy modality that I've encountered. Even if you're not necessarily doing the therapy during the peak of the experience per se, but you're using it as a context before and after the experience, that helps people orient to themselves easily and intuitively.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the metaphor then. That's where we wanted to start with the book of Quieting the Storm Within. Because this is a podcast, most people are listening to this audio only. I know you do have the book next to you. We do have some folks who, we have reels and watch the video on YouTube. But so Quieting the Storm Within. And it's a illustrated book for adults about the overlap of psychedelics and IFS, or just simply IFS?
It's just IFS. Yeah. So the book started as my own need with my clients. I'd start with new clients, and it would take several sessions of needing to explain IFS to them or model it to them. And it took a while. And then there were books that I could recommend, but they were quite long. And sometimes people just don't read books. And so I felt like I really needed a tool and a visual tool to be able to introduce people to internal family systems. And so I just didn't find anything out there that fit what I needed. And so I decided to create it. And so I'm an artist and have been my whole life in a lot of different capacities. And so I started illustrating this book. And the metaphor that I use that I'd kind of been hearing sort of in the IFS community here and there, but that our parts are a little bit like clouds, and that our self, which I'll explain more of later, is like the sun. And so I've used that metaphor of the clouds and the sun throughout the book as a way to visualize this internal model. And I'm dyslexic myself, and so I think it lends myself to being a lot more visual. And so that's why it made it easier to make this into a visual model, because when I'm working with clients, I'm imagining their parts interacting with each other and being, in or around their bodies. And for me, it's a very visual modality. And so it just lended itself quite easily to the book. And so, it's a picture book that's predominantly for adults, but it could be for teens as well. It's, the language is for a slightly older audience, and, it does touch on some more adult themes, but I think teens, and I had a client recently that just shared it with her 14-year-old daughter, and the daughter was apparently feeling really resonant with it. So that made me excited.
So the sun and the clouds. And so when you say that, I think of I go metaphorically, right? The sun has represented sort of light, energy, in some traditions, even God. Mm-hmm. It's a sort of the masculine version of what we think of as divinity or God, this higher self. Whereas the clouds are what maybe blocks us from fully, or not blocks us, blocks our deepest sense of self from receiving the full vitality and energy and aliveness from the sun. So that's at like one more sort of mythopoetic or mythical lens. I'd be curious about how you sort of bring that down then and help it to integrate into IFS and sort of the practicalities of both healing and developmental work.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was meet people where they were at. I wanted to start with maybe the internal struggles. And actually the working title for the book before it became Quieting the Storm Within was The Argument in Our Heads. And so that was because I wanted to meet people that most of us can identify that we have different perspectives in our mind that are often conflicting and arguing with one another. And that's what keeps us often blocked up and locked up and stuck. And so using the kind of thought bubbles, and, I'll describe it because this is a podcast, but the cover of the book is a little head with sort of these thought bubbles / clouds kind of swearing at each other, essentially. And so it's like those thoughts, the thought bubble or the cloud turns into these clouds that are our parts. And so we start to see that they have different perspectives, and that when we turn towards those different perspectives, those different sort of sub-personalities, we can get curious about them and wonder about where they came from. What are they advocating for? What do they need? What do they want for us? And for people, this is often a really radical perspective, because they often think, well, that critical voice in my head is me, right? And then they don't really know that they don't really identify that there's anything more from them, right? And so when people start to be able to use this parts language, it often frees them up a lot to not have just one identity as like this particular aspect of themselves, but to be able to be like, well, a part of me is critical of things, and a part of me is really loving, right? And so it creates, just more flexibility and space.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about then how we go from bringing parts to fighting to be more sort of cohesive and in collaboration? What's that transition like? And maybe even, since this podcast is about psychedelics, how do psychedelics help create more coherence with our parts so there is a sense of integration inside of us? Right.
So this really starts with a practice of listening and doing the best we can and learning how to listen with a lot of curiosity. because often we have vilified those parts of us that either have behaviors or judgments or other types of habits that we don't like, right? The part of me that overeats ice cream, or the part of me that judges other people, right? Or judges myself. And so, but what we can do is ask, hey, I'm just going to use the ice cream as an example, right? It's like, hey, what is it about the ice cream that feels so helpful that you make me want to eat that, right? And it's like, oh, well, it helps me feel calm, right? It helps me feel sedated, or I feel pleasure, right? And it helps me not think about other things in my life that I may be stressed out about. It's like, oh, so this part's actually trying to help reduce my anxiety, right? And so in that understanding, oh, okay, I can see that you're really just trying to soothe me here, right? And now I can maybe not vilify you as like this uncontrollable impulse, right? That is out to do me good, that maybe society has labeled as sort of a sin, right? Like gluttony, right? And to think of it as something that's actually trying to help me, right? To reduce my anxiety. And when we can start to see those parts that have those bad behaviors as something that's actually trying to help, and maybe it's trying to help in like a maladaptive way or an old way that doesn't really work so well anymore. Like maybe in the past, food as a child was a really helpful thing for me to reduce my anxiety in a challenging household or something like that. But now, later that food might not be something that's as helpful, right? And we need to find other ways to be able to address the anxiety, right? The underlying need that's there, but with a new way. And so instead of continuing to pathologize those behaviors and those parts that have those behaviors, but to meet with them with curiosity and compassion, it changes the whole game. And for me, it really embodies what I see right from my own psychedelic experiences of tapping into a deeper sense of love and compassion and oneness, right? And so when I can come towards my parts with compassion, right, or other people's parts, right, when I have someone in my life that is behaving in a particular way, right, I can also see and ask questions of whatever part is showing up for them and show up with compassion. And so this becomes a really humane way, I think, to look at our internal world in a way that we're not exiling, right? And that's some of the words that we use in IFS, is that when we have a behavior or feeling that we don't like, we've exiled it, and that there are parts that become these exiles. And they're still there. They're still having their story about like how they're trying to serve, but they've been exiled. And so we can't really help them until we start to be able to listen. And so how we use that in psychedelic therapy is when people have this framework, right? When they go into psychedelic spaces, then they start to be able to a lot of people have experiences with what they might call their inner child, right? And so those inner children, those parts that are younger than us, they're still living inside of us, right? They still have the wounds or the learnings from our childhood, and we get to start to relate to maybe those inner children or those younger parts of us in a more compassionate way, right? Instead of trying to get rid of them, right? I just need to get rid of that anger. Or I need to get rid of that shame, to be like, hey, what's going on with that anger and that shame? How can I be with this? And so it's an ongoing invitation to be with those parts with compassion. So that's one layer of it. And then just like a little IFS teaching moment here. So the founder of IFS, Dick Schwartz, who kind of, I would say almost he discovered this framework in his own work, over 30 years ago at this point. He started to see these different parts in people, and then started to ask, okay, well, can that part step aside for a little bit so that we can see who else is here? And he kept asking, can that part step aside? Can that part step aside? And then eventually he got to this place where people would say, well, that's not a part, that's just me. And he started to notice that was happening over and over again, that underneath all of the parts, there was this essence that he started to call the self with a capital S. And he noticed that self had similar qualities. And he calls those the 8 C's. So I'm not going to list all of them off, but there's creativity, curiosity, compassion, calm, connectivity, connection. And so when we can tap into that inner resource of that self energy inside of us, that can be something that can continue to lead us to, one, treat our parts and understand what our parts need, right? And what they're trying to advocate for in our human system, right? Because they are we need the parts as do we need ourselves. We are both sort of a human being, right? That has to navigate the world and the material realm. And then we also have this more ineffable essence that's inside of us that connects us to something deeper, higher, more expansive, right? And so I see the parts of us as sort of our human elements, and the self is sort of our spiritual element. And we need both to be able to navigate this life.
Something that came up for me as you were navigating that is David Hawkins' work from Letting Go. When in that book, he talks a lot about how we have these, he calls them negative emotions under a certain level of consciousness: shame, guilt, fear, anger, desire. And part of what I heard in your story, the anecdote with the ice cream, was we often have these negative emotions that are maybe attached to different parts of ourselves, right? And that could be anger, it could be grief, it could be sadness. A lot of it is often shame. And so how we let go of that, Hawkins would say a lot of these emotions we suppress or repress. And so part of the process of healing and growth into accessing more love and compassion and vitality is allowing those negative emotions to fully move through. But oftentimes it's not that easy. It's not just, okay, we can just open up to it, right? We need a modality, we need a process, we need to work with a coach or a therapist or a guide and have sort of a process that we follow. And, sometimes that's psychoanalysis, sometimes that's somatic experiencing. And what I've noticed specific to the psychedelic space is most commonly over the last probably 3 years, the process that a lot of people are turning to is IFS to support this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such an intuitive model. I think that's one of the things. And it's so grounded inherently in compassion. And right, like even like I just had an experience in the last few days where I was deeply meditating on shame and what you were saying, these like negative emotions, right? Like, and seeing the function of them. And through that, so like, let's use shame because that's one that's like so charged, right? And I think even before these last few days, shame was kind of the epitome of the things that we need to address with clients, with myself, everything. But I was recognizing that the part of me that uses shame, right, it is trying to help me be a better person, but it's using this as a tool. But that part really just wants me to be a better person, to be good enough, to be, to self-identify as a good person. So to be able to go one layer deeper than the shame, rather than shaming the shame, right? To look at what in IFS is called the benevolent intent of those parts underneath that, and to say, wow, you are just trying to help me be a better person according to the framework that you have been given, right? Being a good person according to society, to my parents, whatever it is. Right. And so it's so humane. And that's why I love this model. And I think that it's growing because because it's based in that deeper thing.
And that deeper thing is this benevolent sense of self.
Yeah. There's the compassion and seeing seeing a bigger picture, right? And I think that's what psychedelics are always helping us with. They're helping us see from a different perspective, a deeper perspective, a higher perspective, however you want to kind of frame that. But through that perspective, we can see that, it's not just shame, right? We're seeing it in a bigger context of, oh, that shame is serving a purpose. And actually, it's a really important sort of social connection purpose, right? And that's, and moving sort of into almost, there's been an evolution that has used that as a tool for us to survive socially, right? And so that it layers us back out into seeing that benevolence.
Yeah, I like that point about survival, because a lot of the inner child work or a lot of the conditioning that we bring into our adult life tends to be old patterns from when we were anywhere from, a baby until really, I find 11 or 12. From a developmental perspective, there are more patterns and parts that can certainly come online if there is abuse or trauma in later years. But in terms of those early developmental years, and I experienced this growing up in a very religious family, as shame is part of this religious structure and upbringing, and it does serve a certain utilitarian survival purpose, and it has for thousands of years. And yet I think we're now living at a moment in time where we're not asking so much about how do we survive, but really how do we live in greater abundance and resourcefulness and vitality, right? There are people who are like, okay, we don't actually have to live this way anymore. There's a new possibility here. And it seems like psychedelics help us to anchor into that or understand that or feel that in a very somatic way. And I think that was going to be where I was going to take this conversation from here. What is this relationship between parts work and Hakomi, somatic experiencing, other somatic work that you've seen?
Yeah, so our parts, right, obviously in the book they're portrayed in a really visual sort of way, but they can show up so much in our bodies, right? And it's as if we have these different nervous system states when we're what's called sort of blended with a part. And that in that nervous system state, there is whatever those lessons or traumas or tension that's held in that state, it's in the body. And so Hakomi particularly is a way to help people soften and feel safe enough to slowly titrate into those places where they can get into a nervous system state that is the place where they might have been wounded, so that they can have a reparative experience. And so we get to be curious, right? And so, one of the examples I use in the book is like, okay, if we get curious about what's going on in the body, like, okay, I'm feeling tension in my neck. Like, if that tension could have a voice, what would it be saying? Right? Or what images are coming up, or metaphors or words or like little sound bites, or maybe not in, parts like to have sound bites. They'll have like little things that they go on repeat. Or maybe it sounds like somebody else's voice, a parent or a teacher or something. And so we're trying to flesh out how this part is both a physical experience, a visual experience, a auditory, smells, touch, feeling, sensation, engaging all of the senses to see how this part has held on to things and what is experiencing. Because one of the other things that's important to note is that when our parts have these important experiences or impactful experiences when we're young, it's like they get frozen in time a little bit. And so one of my favorite questions to ask parts is, when you look outside of yourself, what is the world that you see? And people will, through their parts will say, people are selfish and awful, right? The world is scary, right? I have to protect myself from this world, right? And so you actually see that, and they may actually have a pretty safe life at this point, but their part is still seeing and is frozen at that time, seeing through that lens, and is still looking out at the world that it sees as so threatening. And so we so part of the process of IFS is to help them leave that old world, right? And somatically, right? To pick up and go to a place that in this, visualized internal world, somewhere that's safe, right? What does your body feel like when you're now in this grassy field, right? Or in your grandmother's house, right? What does that feel like? What are you still holding in your body, right? From that old way of being that you may want to transform. And this is where IFS can get so shamanic in a way, is that when the parts are ready to let go of the memories, the feelings associated with that old, those previous times of pain or fear. And we invite the parts to be able to transform those feelings by offering them up to, internally, but you could also physicalize this, but like offering it up to fire, or giving it to the earth, or blowing it away in the wind, or offering it up to light, right? Or letting the water wash it away, and picking one of the elements, or, whatever else the client or the part wants to use. I've had several clients like to put their bad feelings in like a rocket ship and like shoot it into the sun. So, I love how creative this work is, and it helps people because we're helping people slow down and feel safe enough to go into parts of themselves that they haven't been able to tolerate. And so that's part of the titration work, right? And so often we say, like, we want to be present for this part as it shows you some of the pain that you went through, but let's tell it, like, please ask it that we're only going to just have it share like 1%, maybe 10% of what it's feeling, so that we don't want to overwhelm your system. We want to make this like baby steps, because this is really a consent-oriented modality, right? We're not moving past resistance, right? And that's talked a lot about in therapy, is resistance. And how is resistance, how do we work with a client being resistant? And I'm using air quotes there. Like, that is a part that doesn't feel safe. If you don't feel safe, we got to slow way down and go at a pace that does feel safe enough.
Which I also think is a great metaphor in teaching for psychedelic work, and why the two integrate really well, especially at low doses. One thing I've talked about a little bit on the podcast has been sort of the despair that I feel at the fact that there hasn't been much clinical research on psycholytic dosing, that most of the emphasis has been on these transcendent states. And I totally get why. And for the clinical research and the clinical efficacy, it's important. And yet there's a dearth of information that we have from a clinical lens around, well, how do actually low doses of psychedelics work in such a way where we're not just blowing past resistance and totally destabilizing the scaffolding or the structure of the inner psyche, but we're able to actually, gradually grow it. And I think grow the nervous system's capacity for these emotions to come back online and really hold it in a substantive way.
Totally. Because what you're talking about there, right, is blowing past the protector parts in our system, right? And that's just accosting, right, and causing more distrust amongst the protectors. Because, like, if I just blew past my my comfort zone and I trusted you to help me, feel safe enough, then my protectors are going to come way back online and kind of like, and instead of getting consent. And so how this looks in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in the prep stage is that we are getting very clear on who the protector parts are in our system, what their strategies are, what do they think about doing therapy, what do they think about doing a journey, what are they afraid of, because we want to be really clear. And then we want to say, are you on board enough to do this work? Because if you're not on board, then we need to do some more prep work until you feel like you have gotten all your questions answered, right? Or you feel safe enough with me, right, to be able to step into this non-ordinary state of consciousness. And then that also determines, like, well, which medicine, which, how the dosing, all of these other things, what is the most appropriate way to move forward. But but knowing that it's going to also be a stretch, right? But we're doing it together with the protection systems, right? And that if they feel like something's happening, like that they're feeling uncomfortable about, raise a hand, right? Throw a flag, like let's pause and talk about what's coming up. And then we continue to move forward once that's been addressed, but only once it's done that.
Yeah, I like this metaphor of the 4% rule. I often talk about it as it relates to performance and flow states, that we should choose a challenging goal, objective task that allows us to stretch just a little bit beyond our current capability or capacity, and that generates this state of flow and focus. And I think it's similar with therapeutic work or parts work or psychedelic work. Like, what's that 4% threshold for you? And so for some folks like myself, like I when I first started doing LSD many years ago, I did 2 tabs in the woods, and it actually was really useful and effective, and I learned a lot. And I also, in a way, was fortunate that I had some like religious shame and guilt, but I had a pretty lush, upbringing overall when it came to like my inner psyche and parental care and, all these sorts of things. So I could dive in. And a lot of folks, that's not necessarily the case. And they start with, ayahuasca, arrhythmia, and it's, for some people, it can be really effective and it can work, no doubt. But for some people, it can really cause harm and actually re-traumatization in many ways.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're right that what I've also been seeing in a trend in the community, maybe not so much in the research quite yet, but is to be working with lower doses, right? And moving at a slower pace, right? Especially, right? I mean, back, I think when we both got into this work, right? It was like a lot of like 5-MeO practitioners that would just like blast people out and then like leave the next day and like no support. And like that was just normal. And it was because we didn't really know any better, right? And so, just with more people and more R&D, we're recognizing that there's a lot of different ways to be able to do this. And also, like, how do we create protocols that work for the modern American, right? Or the modern Western person, right? That doesn't have any cultural context for non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so we're just needing to create a new map, right? That has been picking and choosing, right? Obviously, and gleaning things from other cultures and Eastern traditions, right? Meditative and self-reflective traditions. But we're needing to create our own framework.
So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about ketamine and MDMA, since these are the 2 substances clinically that you've worked with, and just talk a little bit maybe about the distinctions and differences between those 2 in terms of how they overlap or intersect with parts work. Like, what are the maybe different ideal use cases? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like ketamine for depression and MDMA for PTSD, but I imagine there is more nuance in that as it relates to parts work and how we bring parts online and what parts come online. I'd love if we could start with the distinctions and differences, and then I might have some questions on overlap or similarities.
Sure. So, I mean, we're navigating a couple different things, right? So there's the legal aspect, right? So I can't prescribe anyone MDMA at the moment. So I'm going to set that I'm going to set that aside for the moment, just because that's kind of, we want to be more clear about like when that is available.
I'd be curious, though, to hear your reflections, though, because you were involved with the MDMA clinical trials and now that you're trained in parts work, even if you just speak to a little bit of what you noticed and saw sort of overarching in that, rather than, like MDMA is still illegal, folks. So, but like just more maybe from a theoretical perspective.
Yeah. I mean, when they will become available, right? And I do also have, I also got partial training through Compass and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, and I also worked with Beckley SciTech. I helped them put together their therapist training manual for 5-MeO. Those are other kind of more official capacities with those other medicines as well. So ketamine, because of its shorter duration, it has a naturally anti-anxiety element to it. Not to say that people don't get sometimes anxious on it, because that does also happen depending on the dosing. But for systems that are a lot more guarded or a lot more blended, right? And that's what we call when people are just really taken over by a part of them or it's usually a really strong protector part of them. And there's just no access to their self, and not a lot of access to recognizing that there are other parts even, right? When people are in those kinds of places, ketamine's a really great, gentle introduction. And then using that within psycholytic dosing, right? Lower doses and, using IFS with ketamine in low doses is fantastic, because you can basically do a normal IFS session that is just really dropped in and slower and deeper with the help of a little bit of ketamine. So I'm doing kind of, using all in the same the framework of IFS, but just with ketamine. And so because it's a shorter experience, it's just more palatable for certain types of people. So I would say that that's not just depression, but that's people trauma. And that's most of the people I work with, that's the underlying thing. It's not anxiety. It's not depression. It's, there's trauma in there, and that's kind of feeding
those
up
are the
into
symptoms,
things.
But there's something underlying that we have to get to, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what psychedelic work is, right? It's getting to the underlying patterns and belief systems and trapped physical, emotions that are trapped in the body. So I think once people have a little bit more trust built online, right? And then moving to something like MDMA is a great next step, especially for people that have trauma. What comes to mind too is just that when we're working with IFS with ketamine, what the ketamine is sort of offering, and this is what I talk with patients or clients about when we start, is that the ketamine is here to help the protectors feel a little bit more safe to be able to go into material, right? into other parts that are holding maybe those fear or trauma responses, right? It's to help so we're not trying to get rid of the protectors. We're not trying to dissociate them away, but we want to really frame it as this is to help them feel, your whole system to feel a little bit more safe. Because ketamine, in the same way that MDMA works by lowering the activity in the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, ketamine also does the same sort of thing. And so ketamine can be such a beautiful way to explore fear from a very different perspective. And so we get to support the clients to be able to look at different parts of themselves or different emotions with a little bit more of a buffer, right? When they've more felt out of control, that their emotions are taking them into these extreme memories or feelings or sensations, and then they're out of control, and that's hard. And so this allows there to be a little bit more of a buffer. For people that, so when there's a lot of emotional intensity, ketamine's really great for that, right? To be able to help them feel a little bit more regulated. For people that are more dissociated in themselves, that's a protection strategy that they've used to completely, separate themselves from their emotion, and that they're really flat. Ketamine can still be helpful in those situations, but that's when something more like MDMA, when people need a more kind of emotional boost, right? A little access more to their self, their heart, their emotional capacity. That's when it's really helpful. And as far as, what I saw in the MDMA clinical trials, we weren't doing IFS therapy in a formal sense, right? That we were supposed to kind of be as neutral as possible as far as therapy goes. But what we saw is that people would just naturally start talking about parts and themselves organically, right? Which is just such a validation of the model, right? And so, I had one of the participants, very quickly after the MDMA started coming on, she saw her, the younger version of herself that was like, traumatized in the floor of a bathroom, right? And she was able to like go to that younger version of herself and like support it. And then like went through this like transformation of sort of like helping her leave the traumatized place and like go to the grassy field with the flowers and having like, and feeling connected. And so we were able to kind of use knowing IFS ourselves, being able to support clients to help their younger parts or their inner child through those processes, but without necessarily teaching IFS or doing it kind of officially. But it was just something that kind of naturally lent itself to that. And so I think that's why it's also been really popular in psychedelic therapy, because it just comes up on its own. And so having this modality to know how to work with that is it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, I really love the point you made about MDMA for like emotional vitality and coming back into the heart, that there is a lot of disassociation today.
And intellectualization, right?
Intellectualization. And even with the widespread use of ketamine, sort of ketamine abuse, which just sort of feeds deeper into this disassociated numbing part that has become very prevalent. And so I do love this notion or idea of MDMA to help reestablish sort of an anchoring in the emotional body and how IFS can support that. I think the next thought that I had was both ketamine and MDMA, I imagine, are, depending on how ketamine is administered, whether it's IV, IM, or troches or nasal spray. But I imagine ketamine and MDMA are easier to do sort of the psycholytic work with, where you can actively engage a client in parts work as you're going through with it. I've also seen this in our underground practitioner community with folks who are doing titrated pen work with 5-MeO. But I imagine with very high doses of psilocybin or 5-MeO, or even very high doses of ketamine, there's a bit of a different process to navigate, because people, when they're in it, they're not really able to verbalize what's going on.
Yeah. I think for higher dose experiences, it's more having the framework, right? To have a little bit of language to be able to use, like when they encounter different parts of themselves, right? That they already know, like, okay, what do I need to, how can I approach this part with more curiosity, right? And so or it's on the back end, right? Because you have a 5-MeO experience and like you're not doing parts work, right? You're having this unitive experience. But where I see IFS and like IFS fitting into a framework with 5-MeO is that being able to feel that spiritual connection in ourselves, right? And then that being the essence of the self, the soul, that divine that's inside of me, and being able to make, when I'm moving through my life, right, and I have to navigate all the stressors of being alive and making my way, how do I support my parts, right, and learn from them what my needs are, but to be able to then use that resource of that divine nature that's inside of me to be able to help me navigate through whatever I'm moving through, right?
Yeah, it's an anchor.
And so, one of the important things that I think is different about IFS than maybe other modalities, especially spiritual ones, is that instead of us trying to be more self-like, right, to be our highest self or be more like that almost fosters a what's called a self-like part that is trying to be like more, it's trying to be more like that. This is more like a process of subtraction to recognize what's actually getting in the way of you just being that, right? It's less active. So we're approaching time, so I think that might be a nice place to end, but it's, well,
there's less of
there's
less of a fixation on fixing and more of a orientation towards emergence.
Yes.
And the emergence of the self. And I think that speaks to even where I notice a lot of coaching and therapy is going.
Yes.
Is how do we get out of this sort of we're these like industrial machines that need to be tweaked and fixed and optimized, and instead get back into sort of the essence of what makes us human and how that inspires us to live and breathe and love all these beautiful things.
Good stuff.
Well, Ashley Booth, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Psychedelic Podcast. This is fun. So folks, check out Ashley's book, Quieting the Storm Within. It's on Amazon. And are you active on any social platforms or any other sort of places you want to point people?
Yeah, so there's a preview of the book if you want to get a look at the preview. The website is ifsandbeyond.com. And then on Instagram, IFS and Beyond as well, is on TikTok. And I also have some really cute like swag. I made like little mugs and stickers and things with the little characters on them, so you can kind of be reminded to, be in yourself today.
Today is a self-care day.
Yeah, and just nurture yourself.
Aww. So what is that? What's in the hands?
It's just a little part that's sweet.
It's a little part.
Yeah, it's a little part being held. So I wanted this for myself, and so I made it so that other people can buy them too, for fun. So yeah.
Fun. So ifsandbeyond.com is the website. Quieting the Storm Within is the book. Thank you for joining us. This was a super rich conversation. It's always nice to drop in and do this publicly. So I had a great time. I hope you did too.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.